Hi class, welcome to week 2 of child psychopathology. Great work so far on your first week. I know it's a lot of material we cover in a short amount of time, and week 1 had 4 chapters of material, so great job. Couple keynotes of things that I want to touch base on. Regarding your papers, if there are any questions regarding the American Psychological Association or APA formatting, please let me know. The main take-home criteria that I am looking at is having a proper cover page, double spacing your work, having it in 12 font Times New Roman, having a references page, and including citations not only from the 2 texts in this class as appropriate, but also another article or 2 or 3 that are sound psychological articles to cite from. You know, Wikipedia or other websites aren't usually based on actual clinical data. So when we are referencing papers, we want to make sure they're actual psychology journal articles that you're citing. This is part of your rubric and part of the grading system, and it adds more depth and support to the claims that you're making. Also, we are on the DSM-5, so the 5th diagnostic manual for mental health disorders. If you have the prior edition of the casebook, it's referencing the prior DSM-4. However, there are some slight differences, especially with childhood disorders. So hopefully, as you're following along in your text, it does point that out in the newest edition of our textbook of abnormal child psychology. This does a really good job of differentiating the differences between DSM-5 and 4. But please keep in mind that is what we are utilizing when diagnosing a child. And please do your best when it does mention DSM-4 or 5. We're wanting you to take a stab at diagnosing the child and have any input on why. You know, on this first case study that we all just completed, there were a lot of flares of several different mental health disorders you could have touched upon or alluded to or tried to support, whether it was major depression, maybe it was PTSD, maybe it was OCD or another anxiety disorder, or most commonly noted in your papers, ADHD. But that child displayed a few elements of things. Of course, we could not concrete diagnose alone from that one case study. We would have had to have met with the child and the family at length over a course of time to come to with firm diagnoses. But I want you to start playing around with differential diagnoses and looking up symptoms that fit that criteria when talking about a family and a child and working with that and imagining that you are the provider kind of working with that family and child and what might you be suspecting as possible diagnoses. It will really help you further down the line in clinical work. This upcoming week, we are on chapters 5 and 6, so a little less reading, which is probably helpful. And what's nice is these chapters really complement one another. We're looking at intellectual disability and children who may be on the spectrum, the autism spectrum. Now, sometimes children have both. A lot of times they may just have an issue on the autism spectrum and be diagnosed as autistic, but not having cognitive deficits or an intellectual disability. You know, intellectual disability is now our more modern term for what used to be mental retardation. And the DSM-5 has made a lot of updates from the DSM-4 regarding this. It used to be back in the day that to have mental retardation, the main criteria was how an individual scored on the WAIS or WISC, the IQ test. The WISC is the child version of the IQ test. Still to this day, we are utilizing that kind of 3-hour, if you will, really in-depth cognitive testing to know for sure how a child or adult is performing on a span of different criteria. And the scoring gives us an idea of the severity. So it's, you know, while you can now still diagnose a child with intellectual disability without having the results yet from a test like this, we have much more better insight when we can have results from a test like that in knowing the degree of impairment. And so usually there are cutoffs, like it used to be 70 and below would suggest that there was impairments. So keep that in mind as you're reading about intellectual disability. It's fascinating, the different approaches and treatments and ways in which families need to make accommodations when living with a child with an intellectual disability and or being on the autism spectrum. New age therapies often utilize a lot of sensory perception work, working out in fields, horseback riding, and things of this nature, using technology to help promote more social skill development. But the reading is really interesting, and the case as well. And then quickly also keep in mind too, when reading the cases, there are also it's always our job to imagine that you actually are working with this family, and you are always a mandated reporter too. So sometimes it can show a lot of depth if in your papers you may also suggest why or why not there are no risk or safety issues at this time that were found. For example, the severity of the abuse. Is there any abuse of any kind? Is there any neglect of any kind? Those are things we would have to report if we suspected that, and or at least consult with Child Protective Services and see if it's worth reporting. Also, is the child having thoughts of death or suicide? We would want to get more in depth asking questions about those things if there's any homicidal or suicidal flares or suggestions of things. You know, in this previous case, case 1, this child had some pretty dark thoughts, which would suggest to definitely some form of depression. And those are things to kind of always be looking out for too when we're talking about safety, keeping the child safe in his or her environment. Lastly, if there are more, I can certainly answer any questions you may have about what's expected with your papers or formatting, so please keep those questions coming. Also, reminder, there's tons of amazing free tutoring and writing services at Bay Path. Take advantage of that if that's something you think you could benefit from. Certainly when I was in college, I had a lot of room for growth in my writing, and it improved dramatically when I got support from these kinds of free services at school. So take advantage of some of those resources that are available to you if you think that it would be of help. And for my list of reminders for today. Also, another thing to obviously also keep in mind in your papers is, are there any possible cultural implications? Any social economic status, poverty, ethnic, family traditions, messages from society or the family that the child's in that suggest some of these behaviors may be related to. Of course, we would want to rule that out first before doing any diagnosing. Sometimes there are things that are normative within a different environment or culture or society that's a subculture of our mainstream American culture that we want to always rule out and check out first to make sure we're not over pathologizing. I think those are my tidbits of info and content and reminders for week 2 as we get into this. I've really been enjoying reading your discussion posts and assignments, and many of you are doing a fabulous job as well, providing really insightful and thoughtful comments to your peers' posts, and I commend you for that. That really makes this class a lot more rich and dynamic and thought-provoking. So great job so far, and keep the questions and input coming. I look forward to next week. Bye.